tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
We will move now to a story that's been brewing in Ottawa for now 3 weeks. It is the criminal mischief trial of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. And what's interesting about this, we haven't been able to cover it from the courtroom because I, can't broadcast live from, courtroom number 3 or whatever they're in. But we've been keeping an update, and I've been keeping tabs on it, and there's been some great reporting that's been taking place. Some of it from Robert Krychuk of Rebel, and also from Trish Wood, who we had on alongside Jacqueline Bynan a couple of weeks ago about a documentary they're putting together on Tamara Lich called The Trials of Tamara Lich. But I wanted to bring Trish Wood back onto the show for a bit of an update on how things have been going. Trish, good to talk to you. This week has been a bit interesting because we've seen some doublespeak from one of the witnesses from what he said during the Public Order Emergency Commission and what he's now saying in the prosecution of Chris and Tamara. What's going on?
Well, it's quite interesting because, let me just say, you're lucky you're not covering the trial because it's one of the most boring things I've ever been involved in as a journalist. And most trials, as you know, Andrew, are full of drama. They create their own culture. They create their own stories. Remember OJ and, if the glove doesn't fit, you must quit and all that wonderful stuff that happened. This trial is a huge drag on one's attention. I mean, maybe it's the airflow problem in the courtroom or something along those lines, but generally it is a case. The Crown's case is a case in search of a narrative. The Crown has not explained in any sensible way exactly why he's leading the evidence he's leading, in the order he's leading the evidence, he has a second chair, young woman, he's leading. And the whole thing has turned into, and I don't want to be disrespectful to the court. I quite like this judge, and I've said so before. I think I said so the last time I was on. She's pretty interesting, tough, smart, doesn't miss a trick, and is managing a whole bunch of really crazy stuff that's going on quite well. But it's becoming a big kind of evidentiary blob. You're not being trained as a good lawyer will kind of put it out day after day to start thinking about the case in a certain way. And you're like, oh yeah, well that could, that maybe that could be true. Maybe they did do it or maybe they didn't do it. It's just kind of throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping it's going to stick. That feels like what's going on. And I don't get it. I do know, I'm sure you know too, that this is not the first Crown. This is not the original Crown. Mm-hmm. That he was removed. And I don't exactly know what happened there. I know that he was pretty zealous and was seen to be zealous, which is not necessarily a good look in a trial that's already being accused of being political. So they brought these two in. Tim Radcliffe is the lead chair. I don't know, maybe it's a last minute thing. Maybe they're just not up to speed on their own evidence, but I am not hearing anything bad about Chris Barber and Tamara Lich day after day after day after day. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And I don't think even like I've been following Canadian press a little bit because they've been sort of okay. Mm-hmm. I don't think even the people who are inclined to look at mainly the legacy media, the people who are inclined to look at Tamara and Chris in the worst possible way, even they're playing it kind of straight because there's not really anything going on. The nub of it, I think, is the phrase "hold the line." And how will that be interpreted? And what did it mean? And what did it mean when various people said it? I also think it will be about, at the end of the day, the interpretation of the phrase mischief, because that can be legally interpreted multiple ways too. But we don't even have a framework of language in this case yet. So it's a really, really strange thing to be participating in, sitting there in the gallery. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to talk about the pace of this, there were initially 22 witnesses the Crown was planning to call. Yeah. I believe there was talk about adding more, but just for context here, we are about to wrap up the third week of trial. There are, under the original schedule, 3 days left, and they've gone through 3 witnesses.
Yeah. So here's what's going on there. Aside from the fact that the witnesses are not saying anything inculpatory about,
they're taking a long time to say nothing. Is that
they're taking long? Well, they're not even saying bad things about the defendants, right? Which you would think the Crown witnesses would be, but there's a lot of procedural stuff that I don't quite understand. And I give trials are really, really hard work, Andrew. I mean, you're in trial all day on your feet, working really hard, and then you go home at night and you prep more. It's a really tough gig for both sides, actually. So I have some sympathy for them. But what I don't understand is why the Crown Attorney, primarily Tim Radcliffe, who's the lead chair, was not better prepared, because a lot of the reasons that we're seeing this slow going with the witnesses is that simple rules of evidence don't seem to have been being adhered to. So we'll just get going, and they'll get 3 questions and answers out from one of their witnesses, and then there is an objection, which the defense is perfectly entitled and should be doing on behalf of their client. And then a long, long discussion on simple things. Like I know with Mr. Ayotte, who's on the stand now, one of the issues was, did he have notebooks? What notebooks can buttress what he's testifying to in court? And my understanding from when I was there the other day is that he didn't have any. So that then becomes a big thing. How do you know what you know? And how do we know that you're saying what you actually know? Like, there are reasons that they do all these really specific things, these rules of evidence in a trial, and they don't. It's not that they're not being adhered to. That's maybe not a fair thing to say. That would be perhaps for an appellate court to sort out later. But they seem to be coming to Mr. Radcliffe as a bit of a surprise. So I don't know if Justice Perkins McVeigh is being a stickler, or if there really is something hinky about the way they are bringing the evidence to court. And some of it makes, the complaints about it make sense to me. Obviously, if you're defending your client, you need to know exactly what the Crown's going to lead, so you can prepare your defense and your, arguments. I mean, court really is about arguing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to prepare yourself, you need to know what they're going to lead and whether it's credible and where they got it and all that stuff. And that didn't seem to be being happening. So this is dragging. And I will say that the judge is saying that, she looks kind of irritated at times, and not yet irritated with defense. Now, they're not leading evidence yet, but she does seem somewhat irritated with this Crown and with the process. No one wants this. No one wants to be a judge in charge of a proceeding that's sort of crawling along. The eyes of the country, are on this. Yeah. And I'll say this, Andrew, I'm not a purely objective observer. I was a journalist long enough to know that I do have sides a bit in this. I can sort out truth from non-truth, but I do wish these charges hadn't been laid. And I kind of favored the convoy. I think people know that. But putting that aside, I feel like everybody involved in it, including the judge, wants this case to be decided on the facts as they're presented, whether you think the charges should have been brought or not. And I think it's going to be really, really difficult for the Crown to prove its case in this. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, but
yeah,
I'm not hearing
some of the clips that I was told were played earlier on in this trial had nothing to do with Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. And it's funny because the Crown made a point of saying early on in his opening remarks, this is not trying them for their political beliefs. And I believe he had also made a comment about it not being about the convoy itself.
Yeah.
And yet his case has involved trying to basically put the convoy on trial.
Well, I almost want to put my hand up and say, Mr. Radcliffe, so why did you lead that clip? What am I supposed to glean from that? Because I'm not getting it. There was a guy on from the Sûreté de Quebec. This is how kind of absurd some of the evidence is. And he was part of what they were calling the Green Squad. And if you remember, when they brought the convoy down, and by this time, bear in mind, Tamara and Chris had already been arrested. They weren't even there. This was
just for the audience to be aware, they were arrested before the major police operations took place. So I mean, anything that happened after that point, I mean, yes, you could argue maybe they had encouraged it before, but they weren't there. They weren't involved. They were in a cell.
Yeah. So the Sûreté Quebec is doing this, I guess it's called a clearing operation, or at least that's what the military calls it. And he was with the Green Squad. And there was a point where he's kind of talking about what they're doing. You see this, I believe it was body cam footage. And this is kind of heartbreaking too, that here are these far right, terrorists, according to some people, including legacy media, all these guys, kind of military age guys, chanting love over fear, right? They're not misbehaving. They're standing calm and true and chanting love over fear in the face of this really overpowering police presence. I think at that point the police were behaving as well. I'm not dumping on them. But here they are, they're all on their black bloc, and it's, very scary, and we don't know what's going to happen. And then there was kind of a moment where this police officer from the SQ says, well, and then we went for lunch. And so, of course, the defense counsel, Lawrence Greenspan, says something like, well, you went for lunch? So there's this big moment of, we've got to, secure the area from these scary people, but we're going for lunch. So, I mean, there are moments that maybe are not like intended to be really representative of what's going on, but they actually were. Like, they weren't so scared that they couldn't go to the Chateau Laurier for lunch. He clarified he wasn't eating at the Chateau Laurier. No one can afford that. They took their lunches to the Chateau Laurier. So that's the kind of stuff we're seeing, right? I mean, I haven't seen anything in the videos that did anything but really act as exculpatory evidence for the defense, except there are chants of hold the line. I know that's going to be discussed forever and ever, but it is showing some pretty, how can I put it, subdued behavior on behalf of the protesters. And I don't know if you remember this, if I said this on the last show, but when they first started showing these videos, and you're like, oh, what's going to be in them? They're going to be so terrible. And what happened was the protesters looked pretty responsible, but also in these clips, there were photographs and images of the police beating protesters in the head. And the judge noticed that. She noticed. So whatever they're leading, it always seems, it's kind of like, dare I say, the Roadrunner and the Coyote, like they keep dropping the anvil on, maybe I'm overstating it, but.
Do we know when they're going to settle the trial schedule itself? Just to get back to the housekeeping side of this, because again, the dates that were originally planned, they were going to, I believe, run tomorrow as well. They weren't running Fridays, but I believe they're scheduled to go tomorrow, and then they were going to take a 2-week break and finish off October 11th to 13th. And I know they've talked about needing to add more dates. Has that been settled yet?
Not as far as I know, but I came back yesterday, so I don't know if there's been movement on that. I get the sense that they've still got a long way to go with this. And it's also interesting too, because covering it then becomes a problem, right? It costs money to be in Ottawa.
Yeah.
I'm paying hotels, I'm as you all know. And you're like, nothing's really happening. You're waiting for the big trial moment. And nothing is happening. It's almost all procedural. None of it's making very much sense. And you kind of go home at the end of the day thinking, man, what am I going to write about? So I've been writing about how bumpy the train ride was going down to Ottawa. I was writing about other trials I've covered. I mean, there's not all that much to say. And yet, this is a massively important trial in Canadian history, isn't it? And if they are convicted, then we better know why it happened. And that's essentially why we're all there and still kind of hanging in with something that even a lot of the protesters have disappeared. They're bored too.
Trish Wood is the host of Trish Wood is Critical, and you should always follow the work she does because you are never going to be disappointed if you do. Trish, thanks so much, as always, for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.